Paul informs Timothy in 1 Timothy 3:2 that elders are to be hospitable. And then in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 3, Peter commands the elders to set an example to those who are under their care. So clearly God is concerned about hospitality, and that at the leadership level, elders set the example in hospitality so the entire church is effective in hospitality. And there's a good reason for that. The reason is that gospel-motivated and informed hospitality is absolutely necessary as an environment in which people come to know the good news of Jesus Christ, experience it, and get changed by it. And so the very environment of disciple-making requires that we must be hospitable. Now, in order to understand the command to be hospitable, which we're going to see several times throughout the scriptures, we've got to understand the origin of what hospitality is. A lot of times I think people, when they think about hospitality, they just think, oh, hospitality is just Christian fellowship. It's, believers hanging out together, believers eating together, believers just being with one another. And yet, that's not what hospitality means. If you get at the heart of hospitality, you'll find that hospitality comes from two key Greek words that together means loving strangers. That's really what the word hospitality means. It's a love for strangers. It's a love for the outsider. In general, another way to think about hospitality is treating a stranger as an equal to the host by creating an environment or a space in which the stranger is protected, the stranger is provided for, the stranger is taken care of, all of which is followed by then helping the stranger move from being a stranger to being a family member. That's the goal of hospitality, is to go from the outsider to the insider. It's to treat someone who doesn't belong as though they do belong, to the point at which they get to a place where they really belong. And that's become true of them. So that's the intent in hospitality. But let's look at the origin of hospitality. If we go all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, we see that God starts with creating an environment for people to belong, in particular Adam and Eve. He creates a perfect environment for all their needs to be met, for them to live in perpetual rest. Even while they're working, they're to be at rest. They're to trust God as their provider. They're not to worry about anything at all. Just rest in Him and trust Him and believe that He's good enough and has provided well enough for all of their needs. And that's how the whole thing starts. And Adam and Eve had perfect harmony with God in the garden, trusting Him, walking in fellowship with Him. And that's really our best picture of what hospitality looks like, is the Garden of Eden. If we want to go back and say, what's the best picture? That's it. Now we know that they don't trust Him, they don't rest in His provision, they don't look to God as the one who can best take care of their needs. And so what they do is they look elsewhere, and that's the beginning of the brokenness of relationship between God and human, between human, and between human and creation. And so we go from a very hospitable environment to a hostile environment. And so now we have hostility instead of hospitality. We have division instead of unity. We go from belonging to being outcast. And that's what sin produces. And so the reason why hospitality is so imperative for the church is because it's our way of showing God's desire and pursuit of bringing us back into the environment that He created in the first place. That's what we're doing when we exercise hospitality, is we're pointing backwards to the garden and forwards to the future, where all things will be as they ought to be in our relationship with God, with one another, and creation. And so that origin is absolutely imperative, and what destroyed it is absolutely imperative that we know, that we realize the destruction of hospitality was when we stopped trusting God, stopped resting in God, stopped looking to God, and then as a result, we started looking to one another as enemies instead of allies. And Adam and Eve immediately experienced that amongst themselves. They began to blame one another. They blame the serpent. So now we're enemies of God, we're enemies of one another, we're enemies of creation. And that's the antithesis of hospitality. Hospitality is to be at rest with God, experiencing oneness with God, being provided by for God, trusting God in all things, and then saying, now let's bring others into that caring environment where they get to experience the same care we receive from God in our relationship. So we start in Genesis 1-2. We see that it got destroyed in Genesis 3. And then we move forward to Genesis 12 through 15, where God calls the people through Abraham to be His people, in which He would once again restore a hospitable people to the world so the world could be brought in, and any stranger that would come in into the people of God would be treated as though they belonged to the people of God. And that was God's intent for His people. It's interesting that God then at some point allows Israel to experience being treated like strangers themselves. You might remember in Egypt when they're treated like the outsider, and they're treated as the ones who are rejected, and they're not welcomed in, and they're not cared for like they belong to Egypt. In fact, it starts that way with Joseph, that they're cared for like they belong, and Joseph is cared for like he's one of the Egyptians. And through Joseph, God uses him to save the people of Israel, to bring them into a place, to care for them well. But the next Pharaoh forgets. And the next Pharaoh says, no, you're going to be our slaves. You're going to exist to serve us instead of we serve you. And so what happens is it all flips. And Israel gets to experience what it's like to be strangers in the land that they used to be welcomed into. And so they get treated as slaves, and they are truly slaves. But it's almost as if God is trying to say, I'm going to show you what it's like when you're in another nation and they don't exercise hospitality. I want you to know what it feels like to be the outsider who's not welcomed in, to be the outsider who's used instead of served. And so when God then rescues His people out of slavery, pay attention to what He commands that they do. And we don't have enough time in this session to go through all of the scriptures in the Old Testament, but I'd encourage you to read especially Leviticus and Deuteronomy in terms of the commands for hospitality. In particular, I want you to turn to Leviticus 19 right now. We're going to start in verse 9, Leviticus 19, verse 9. And this is after they've been rescued out of slavery, and God is clarifying how they must live in the land that He's bringing them into. And so He says this to them, verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. That's the stranger that's coming into their midst or traveling through. I am the Lord your God. So already we hear Him saying, make sure you do not build your budget in such a way that you live to the ends of your budget. But you always create space in your budget for the needs of the outsider, the needs of the stranger, the needs of the person that you may come across. And I will just tell you, my observation in most of the budgets of people who live in the United States is they spend to the edge of their budget, leaving no margin for the stranger, no margin for hospitality. What you'll find as you begin to engage in missional community life is it's going to cost you. I've actually had people say, like, we can't do this. It's changing our budget for groceries. We got to feed more people, and we got to, we might have stuff taken out of our homes, and so that's hurting our insurance, or we've lost items, or my car gets banged up a lot more, or whatever it may be, and we have to actually plan for that. We have to say, like, that's God's intent. God's intent is that you would budget for the stranger, that you'd budget for hospitality. And that's what God's saying to His people. Don't glean to the edge of the field, budget margin for hospitality in your work. And you'll have to do that as a missional community. You'll have to say, okay, what are we going to change about our budget? By the way, you'll know if people are getting on mission if they start to factor this into their budgeting. If they're not on mission, they're still seeing mission or the missional community or the work of the gospel as an extracurricular activity if they got anything left over. Instead of, no, it's on the front of your budgeting. You plan for it before you plan everything else. And so that's what God wanted the people of Israel to do. Now, if you keep going in chapter 19, you'll find that He says this in verse 33. When a stranger sojourns with you in your land, you shall not do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you. It's really important. That's basically saying treat them like you would treat yourself. What would you want for you? That's what you do for them. So treat them as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Hear what he's saying. He's going, I did this to you in a strange land so that you could do it to others. And that's a thing that I want you to trace as we keep teaching. I want you to trace that theme of hospitality. Whatever God did to you, now he wants to do through you to others. So let's jump ahead to another passage, Deuteronomy 10, just to look at another one of God's communications to his people about this particular issue. Look at verse 18 in Deuteronomy 10. He executes justice for the fatherless and the widow, and he loves the sojourner, giving him food and clothing. Love the sojourner, therefore, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. Now pay attention to that. He's saying, in the same way that I treated you, now you treat others. And so we should even be asking, if you want to do a study, go and look at what God did to Israel, how he fed them in Egypt, how he rescued them from slavery and injustice, how he was willing to pay the price for that to happen and do whatever needed to take place in order for them to be set free. And then when he gets them out, he's the one who provides for their daily food. Every day they come out, there's manna on the ground, and eventually there's even quail because they start to complain about the manna. And then he makes sure their sandals don't wear out, so he's providing for their very clothing, and he helps them to build shelters, so now they have a place to find shelter from the weather. And then he puts himself in the midst of them through a tabernacle so that he's dwelling in their midst. He's joining them in their journey. And then what does he do? He even provides means for them to get restored when they fail through the sacrifice of an animal. And so God is caring for them as people who are outsiders who now are being treated like insiders, even though they're even wandering. And you can just imagine what it must have been like for Israel to be wandering through the desert going, do we belong anywhere? Does anybody care about us? And God's going, while you were in that state, I cared for you. I fed you, I clothed you, I provided you shelter to lead you to the ultimate place where you could rest forever in my care. And that's the goal, is that along the way, while a stranger is feeling out like an outsider, you're treating them like an insider until they get to that final goal where they're an insider, where they're part of the family, where they're part of the community. And the goal of hospitality is to treat them like they already belong before they belong, to care for their needs like they were family, like they were brothers or sisters, because you care for them like a native in the land. You care for them as one who you would love in the way you would want to be loved. And so that was God's command to Israel. And they failed. They failed miserably at this. And they continued to think they were entitled, that they believed that they deserved what they got, instead of it was grace, that it was God's gift, that they would receive this kind of care. And in their forgetfulness, they failed then to treat others in the way that God had treated them. And so they only gave people what they felt they were entitled to get. And we do this too. I know all the time. We're like, oh, I don't want to treat them like that because they'll take advantage of us. Or, they don't really appreciate it. It's like, really? Is that what God said to Israel? God was faithful to them all the way through, no matter how many times they grumbled and complained. And then you see Jesus showing up as the ultimate act of God's care for the stranger. And he brings the best picture of hospitality you could ever imagine. Now, before we go into the life of Jesus, I just want to stop and bring you into the culture that's informing hospitality in regards to all the worldviews that Jesus walks into when he calls people to be hospitable. There's Roman, there's Hebrew, and there's Greek, to name a few. And in this culture, the roots of hospitality are kind of found in this idea. One of them was the idea of taking a hostile stranger or enemy and treating them as you would treat yourself. Not just a stranger, but a hostile one. In fact, Jesus even speaks into that and says, love your enemy as yourself. Pray for those who persecute you. So it's the opening up of your life to the one who is not just a stranger, but is almost hostile to you. You might, if you didn't see the movie, I'll ruin it. This will be the spoiler. But if you saw the Lone Survivor, it's a beautiful picture of what this is all about, because in that particular case, you've got soldiers who are, I think they're in Afghanistan. Are they in Afghanistan or Iraq? Afghanistan? And There's only one who survives. They're going in to do a reconnaissance mission to figure out what's going on in the area, to get ready for, to get some information. And 4 of the people are killed. 1's left. The guy needs to get out. He gets discovered by what looks to be like a shepherd or just a regular civilian. But his first thought is, I'm dead. This guy's going to kill me because he's one of the enemies. And this guy takes him into his house. And the principle of hospitality in that particular culture is, if you find somebody and they don't belong, you must treat them like they belong to the point of giving up your own life. Protect them to the point that you would die for them. So this guy takes in an American soldier into his house with his son, and the village knows as soon as he walks into the village with this guy next to him, they all have to now give up their lives to protect this one person. That was the principle of hospitality. And so they then proceed to fight off the Taliban, and many of them are killed just to save this one American soldier. And in the film, it actually says, this is what hospitality is in this part of the world, in the Middle East. Well, that's the context that Jesus shows up in, and you can see like God's brilliance in setting the culture to believe that about hospitality, because who's the one who's going to give up his life so that we can all be brought in? It's Jesus. He's the one that's going to say, I will treat you like you belong, even though you're an enemy, according to Ephesians 2 of God. You're a child of wrath, but I will go into the camp and I will bring you in to the inner place with God at the cost of my own life. And I will die so that you will no longer be a stranger, but you'll be treated as one of us. And that picture was in that part of the world. So when they spoke of hospitality, that's what they understood it to be. I don't think that we have that context very well in our own situation. I don't think we think at the cost of our lives we will take people in. I think we have a sense of entitlement and protection and comfort to say, my home is my castle, it's my place of refuge, it's the one place that nobody gets to come into. And yet the scriptures teach it's just the opposite. Jesus is your refuge, and your house is a place of ministry for the stranger, to feel welcome, to feel cared for, to be a part of a family. It's interesting, in the Greek understanding of hospitality, when a stranger would pass outside of a house of any Greek citizen, they were expected to invite the stranger in, just if they passed in front of the house. And if they saw him pass, they had to invite them. Come on in. Now they could refuse to come in, but they were all expected to invite them in. And then once they were invited in, the expectation was you first of all wash their feet. You care for their physical needs. You offer them food or wine. And only after they feel comfortable can you begin to ask them their name or anything about them. Isn't that crazy? We do kind of the opposite, right? No one's coming in my house until I know them really, really, really well. In the Greek culture, it was, you don't get to know them really, really well until you've served them. And then you get to know them really, really well. Can you imagine what would happen to our view of hospitality as Christians if we said, not only do we want to invite those that are outside, that don't belong in, but we're also going to be very intentional to not be worried about what they believe or what they think or where they stand on certain issues before we serve them and love them. Our primary purpose will first and foremost be to love them and serve them and make sure their needs are met. And then we'll ask them their name, and then we'll get to know their story, and then we'll get to find out what they believe about certain issues. But we do just the opposite, don't we? We refuse to serve and love until we know where they stand on certain things. And the Greek context was, no, you don't even get the privilege of getting to know a person until you first of all exercise hospitality to the person. Now, all that was mingled in with another practice that was kind of bleeding through, and this is certainly not biblical, but in that context, the idea of hospitality stemmed from the thought that the gods mingled among humans. And so it's very possible that you could play host to a deity poorly if you weren't exercising hospitality. So there's certainly some fear based in that, and what if God showed up? Or what if a God showed up? How would we treat them? Now you can just think now about that context when Jesus says, whatever you did unto the least of these, you did unto me. He's speaking into a context going, I know what you know about hospitality. And when I was naked, you didn't clothe me. And when I was hungry, you didn't feed me. And when I was sick, you didn't come and take care of me. When I was in prison, you didn't visit me. In other words, you didn't exercise hospitality when God showed up, because God was amongst you. And the amazing thing is Jesus says, you know when God's amongst you? Whenever the least are amongst you. Whatever you've done unto the least of these, you've done unto me. And that's why in Hebrews 13:12, when it says that even when we should exercise hospitality, because who knows, you might be entertaining angels unaware. You may not realize you might be entertaining a deity showing up in some form or another. And that idea was not that you might actually have a real angel, but the angel word is actually the word messenger. And so it might mean God is sending a messenger your way. And he's wanting you to minister to the messenger as though the messenger was coming from him. That it was his messenger. And the messenger was a representative of another power, a king or a ruler or even a god. And so the idea that a messenger, an angel, that's what it meant, would come, and you may not even know it, was a way of God saying to us, always expect that I'm showing up. Treat everyone that comes to your door as though it's me. I remember one time I was really convicted about this because Janie came to me, we were talking about this once, and I had one of our renters show up at our door, and he needed some help, and he stayed at the edge of the door, and I was, there's always that threshold, and so I was standing on the inside of the threshold, and he was standing on the outside, and talked to him the whole time, and we got done, and she said, Jeff, if that had been Jesus, what would you have done? And I'm like, well, I would have invited him in, and I would have asked if he's hungry, and I would have said, what can I do for you? And she's like, that's what he told us to do to everyone. Why don't we do that? And she wasn't coming down on me as much as asking us a question of our household. Are we willing to let the threshold go and invite people across the threshold and treat them as though Jesus showed up at your house? That's what Jesus expects of his people, because that's exactly what Israel was treated like by God himself. And that's what we were treated like by Jesus. In fact, Paul says in Ephesians 2, verse 11, therefore remember that one time you were Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision. This is verse 11, which is made in the flesh by hands. Remember that you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he himself is our peace, he who has made us both one and has broken down in his flesh the dividing wall of hostility by abolishing the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in place of the two, so making peace, and might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross, therefore killing the hostility. And he came and he preached peace to you who are far off, and peace to those who are near. For through him we both have access in one spirit to the Father, so that you are no longer strangers and aliens, but are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Isn't that amazing? We've been brought near. We're no longer strangers. We're part of the household. And so the gospel deeply informs and motivates us on how we should engage in hospitality. Now, I just want to take the last few minutes and talk through what could we do? What might it look like to really believe this and live it out? I want to just frame it up in three ways. First of all, when we look at hospitality, we're talking about creating a place for people to be, to just to be themselves. And then we want to create a place where they can become. They can become something they weren't. And then lastly, we want them to be able to be a people who can go and do the same to others. So think about it. When you're giving people a place to just be, well, think even in your own life, where did you feel most at ease to be you? What was required for that? Well, first of all, the first part of that is that you were welcomed, that you were greeted, that there was love, that there was affection expressed right away. It's interesting that the scriptures give us commands to greet one another with a holy kiss. I don't know that we all have to go around kissing these days, because in our culture it may not be quite as acceptable, but what that meant in that day was I have affection for you. I want to express it physically. I want you to know that I care deeply about you. In our culture, that may be a handshake, that may be an arm around the shoulder, that may just be a greeting. Just, hey, we're so glad you're here. It's amazing how many times I walked into someone's house and they're like, hi there. And they just open the door and then they turn around instead of like, hey, come in. We're so glad you made it. Welcome to our house. We are thankful you're here. We're glad to have you. Like, express a desire to have people in your life by a greeting. And then second, in order to be, there's got to be not only a welcome or a greeting, but there's also got to be a sense of rest, where you create a place where rest can be experienced. And that can take the form of a lot of things. But just think about when people are on a journey, they need to get their feet up. Maybe they get the lazy boy chair and you get off it. I have a favorite chair in my house, and some of you know that. And if you come to my house and if I give it up, that's a big expression of my love for you, because it's my favorite chair. So you can kick your feet up. Give them a place to kick their feet up. To say, like, what do you need? How can I just give you a place to be? And here's the thing. I think too often we demand way too much when people enter into our house, instead of just giving them a place to just be. And then not only welcomed and rested, but a place where they can be their true self. Another way to think about it is we let them be naked. I don't mean physically. I just mean they don't have to impress us. They don't have to say things right. They don't have to do things right. You open up your home and you expect that they're coming with all their scars, all their brokenness, and it's okay. It's okay for them to have things that don't go perfectly. It's okay for their kids to be running around and not be perfectly obedient and submissive. It's the reality of hospitality. You let them be their true self so they can rest. The beauty is God did not tell us to get ourselves cleaned up before He welcomed us in. We had to first of all admit how desperately needy we were and broken we were before we could even enter in. It's actually the requirement of receiving the hospitality of Jesus is to say, I'm a mess. So He gave us freedom to be a mess. We got to give people a freedom to be their true self. Now, we also don't want them to stay that way, though. We want them to become something. We want them to become whole. And we want to have a commitment to their wholeness, that they would become a people restored to God. I love it when Jesus is with people. He doesn't just love them and welcome them in, but He calls them to a new life. He makes it possible for them to live a new life. And whenever people are with Jesus, they leave changed. And that's the beauty of hospitality, is it's committed to the people's development. Not just committed to feeding them, but helping them to be fed spiritually. A few things that I think through when I think through how we can help people become is we want to serve their real and felt needs. And we want to feed them both physically and spiritually. When you think about someone coming to your house, go, what do they need? Gosh, the guy doesn't have any shoes. Or, it looks like their kids, it looks like they're all doing hand-me-down clothes, and the last one clearly has gotten the hand-me-downs from 3 or 4 generations here, and they're rotten. Okay, they need clothes. Pay attention to what they need. They talk a lot. Well, maybe they don't have any friends. So open your ears and listen. Maybe that's what they need. Maybe they really are hungry. Maybe they haven't been eating very healthy food for a long time. Who knows what they need, but give them a place where you both serve and feed them both physically and spiritually. And our desire ultimately is to feed them the bread of life, Jesus Christ. Our desire is to let them experience the servanthood of our King and the feeding of the bread of life in very physical forms before we expect that they're going to be able to receive it in spiritual forms. So we start in a physical way, serving and feeding, with a goal that we get to a spiritual serving and feeding by bringing them Jesus, serving them the King of Kings, showing them what our King's like, serving them the bread of life by teaching them about what He's done through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then lastly, we want to help them actually do. And what that means is we're welcoming, we're loving, we're greeting, they're rested, they're growing up in wholeness, we're committed to their whole life development, but we want to call them to something because, see, here's the deal, is it doesn't help people to make them perpetually dependent. We want them to become mature believers so that they can go and bring hospitality to others, which means you're going to have to teach them how to do the very things you've done. It means you're going to have to actually go into their home and show them how to do it and train them in what it looks like to be hospitable people where they're at. And that's the beauty of gospel hospitality, is that it's something that God does to you so that He can do it through you. Now, what I'd like to do as you just think through your missional community and its present state of hospitality is just consider these things. Are we a place where people can just be at rest? Be naked, figuratively? Be a mess and still be loved? Is it a place where people are becoming whole by the way we serve them physically, feed them physically, serve them spiritually, feed them spiritually? And are we growing in our hospitality out into the community God sent us to so that more and more homes are places of refuge for the people that are strangers in our midst that don't know the love of God? A couple questions I'd love you just to work through as you even think through those concepts is, first of all, one, how does the story of God's hospitality change your view of hospitality? Second, what aspects of hospitality do you most struggle with and why? And third, how can we as a missional community create a more hospitable environment for others to experience being, becoming, and eventually doing?